Daniel had lived alone on his ranch for many years, so long that most people in town barely remembered when he last had visitors. The ranch was miles away from the nearest house, and the dirt road leading to it often stayed empty for days. He woke up before sunrise every morning, fed the cattle, checked the fences, fixed whatever was broken, and ended the day sitting alone at his small wooden table. Sometimes he talked to his horse just to hear a voice nearby. Loneliness had become a quiet companion, one he never invited, but one that never left. He wasn't a man who complained. Life on the ranch was tough, but he accepted it. Still, as time passed, the long silence started to feel heavier. When he walked inside the empty house at night, the quiet made him realize how much he missed having someone to talk to, someone to sit with during dinner, someone who would smile when he came home after a tiring day. He saw married couples in town, families laughing near the general store, and young couples walking by the church on Sundays. He felt a small pinch inside his heart every time. He wasn't jealous. He just wished he could have something like that too. One evening, after a long day of repairing a broken fence, Daniel sat in his kitchen with a cup of warm tea. The wind was blowing outside, shaking the windows, and the old clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room. He suddenly felt the weight of loneliness more than ever. A thought came into his mind, something bold, strange, and uncomfortable. He had heard about men finding partners through mail-order services. Some ranchers far from towns had done it. They wrote letters to women in cities, or even other countries, hoping to find someone who wanted a new life in the West. Daniel had never considered it before. It felt unusual, maybe even foolish. But that night, the idea stayed in his mind longer than he expected. The next week, when he went to town to buy supplies, he found himself standing outside the post office with a paper in his hand. It was an application for a mail-order-bride service that someone had handed him a few months earlier. He had kept it folded in his coat pocket, but never thought seriously about it. Now, he looked at it again. The letters on the paper seemed strange at first, as if they were meant for someone else. But slowly, he filled out his name, age, and a short description of his life. He told the truth. He was a simple rancher, hardworking, honest, and looking for companionship. He didn't make big promises, but he wrote with sincerity. He mailed the application, feeling both nervous and hopeful. Weeks passed. Then months. Daniel received a letter from the service saying he had been matched with a woman from a distant American city. Her name was Anna, and she had written a short introduction. She sounded kind, educated, and ready to start a new life. Daniel felt warmth in his chest as he read her words. For the first time in years, he imagined a future that wasn't quiet and lonely. They exchanged a few letters. Though the letters were short, Daniel tried his best to show his true self. He didn't pretend to be someone he wasn't. Anna thanked him for his honesty and said she appreciated that he lived a peaceful life away from the noise of crowded cities. Daniel cleaned the house several times even though it was already clean. He washed the sheets, replaced old curtains, and bought fresh candles. He even fixed a rocking chair and placed it near the fireplace, thinking she might like it. His nerves grew stronger each day as the arrival date came closer. He went to town 3 times to ask if the stagecoach schedule had changed. People teased him kindly, saying a bride would surely make him talk more than usual. Daniel laughed shyly, his face turning a slight shade of red. Finally, the day arrived. The sky was bright, the road dusty, and Daniel stood near the wooden platform where the stagecoach usually stopped. He wore his cleanest shirt, combed his hair, and kept adjusting his hat, nervously. His heart thumped loudly every time he heard wheels in the distance. When the stagecoach finally appeared down the road, his breath caught. This was the moment he had waited for. The stagecoach stopped, and people stepped down one by one. A family, a traveling salesman, an old couple, returning from a visit. Daniel searched each face, looking for the woman he had seen in the small photograph the agency sent. but she wasn't there. Instead, a young Chinese woman stepped down slowly, holding a small cloth bag close to her chest. Her clothes were simple, worn from long travel. She looked around with tired but hopeful eyes. When she saw Daniel, she walked toward him as if she knew exactly who he was. Daniel felt his heart drop. This was not Anna. This was not the woman he was expecting. The Chinese woman stopped in front of him and bowed her head politely. She said something softly in Chinese, words he couldn't understand. Her voice shook slightly, showing she was scared, but still trying to be brave. She held out a folded letter written in symbols he didn't recognize. Daniel stood frozen. The townspeople nearby watched with confusion. A few whispered to each other. Someone said, "That's not the lady he was waiting for." Another said, "Maybe there's a mistake." Daniel felt the embarrassment rising inside him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman looked at him with anxious eyes, waiting for him to respond, but he didn't know what to say. He took the letter gently from her hand. The paper felt thin and fragile, like the woman who stood before him. The writing was all in Chinese characters, meaning nothing to him. She kept pointing to the letter, then to him, trying to explain something, but the language barrier stood like a tall wall between them. Daniel realized she had nowhere to go. She had traveled far, probably across the sea and across the country, trusting the promise of a new life. He could not send her back onto the road alone. Even if she wasn't his bride, he couldn't leave her standing helpless in the middle of town. So he nodded slowly, motioning for her to follow him. She walked beside him, quiet and unsure. Daniel could feel her fear, and he tried to soften his expression to comfort her. He helped her climb onto his wagon and drove toward his ranch. The ride was silent except for the wheels rolling over dirt and the occasional call of a bird. Daniel kept glancing at her, trying to understand who she was and why she had come. She held her bag tightly, staring forward as if everything around her was strange and unfamiliar. When they reached the ranch, she looked at the land with wide eyes. Daniel helped her down gently. She stood near the porch, unsure where to go, waiting for Daniel's direction. He opened the door slowly, inviting her in. She stepped inside with small, hesitant steps, looking around the house as if trying to understand her new surroundings. Daniel stood behind her, wondering what fate had brought this unexpected visitor into his life. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He didn't even know a single word she was saying. All he knew was that she needed help, and he was the only one she had. Daniel woke up the next morning feeling confused, tired, and uneasy. The Chinese woman was sitting quietly at the small table in his kitchen, her hands folded in her lap. She looked as if she had not slept much. She gave him a shy nod when he walked inside, but she said nothing. Daniel tried to smile politely, even though his mind was still spinning from everything that happened the day before. He had expected a bride he had written letters to for months. But instead, a woman he couldn't understand had stepped off the stagecoach with a letter full of symbols he couldn't read. He poured himself a cup of water and wondered how he should handle the day. She watched him carefully, as if waiting for his permission even to breathe. He pointed to the chair opposite hers, and she sat straighter, showing she understood at least some gestures. Daniel decided to make breakfast. It felt strange having someone else inside the kitchen. He tried not to look too confused as he moved around the room. When he set a plate in front of her, she looked surprised and then nodded gratefully. She held the fork awkwardly, as if unsure she was using it correctly. Daniel noticed and felt a small pull of sympathy inside him. She must have grown up eating in a very different way. He didn't want her to feel embarrassed, so he ate slowly, hoping she could follow his movements. She copied him carefully, taking small bites, her eyes shifting between her plate and his. When they finished, Daniel took out the letter she had given him. He studied the unfamiliar writing again. It looked delicate, written by someone who cared about what they were saying. He pointed to the characters, and then to her, trying to ask her what it meant. She tried to explain, using her hands, shaping the air as she spoke softly in Chinese. Her tone changed as she spoke, sometimes sad, sometimes hopeful, but none of it made sense to Daniel. The only thing he knew for sure was that she needed help, and she had no idea where she was supposed to go. He decided to take her to town again. Maybe someone there could read the letter. He gestured toward the door, motioning for her to follow. She picked up her small cloth bag and walked behind him like a child, unsure of what would happen next. The ride back to town felt even quieter than the previous day. Daniel tried to think of what to do. He considered writing to the mail order service, but that would take weeks. He needed answers now. When they reached town, people turned to look at them. Some whispered, others simply stared in curiosity. Daniel ignored them and led the woman into the general store. Mr. Green, the owner, looked up from behind the counter with raised eyebrows. "Morning, Daniel. Everything all right?" he asked, already sensing something unusual. Daniel explained the situation as simply as he could. "She arrived yesterday instead of the woman I was waiting for. She doesn't speak English. And I don't know what this letter says." He handed the folded paper to Mr. Green, who squinted at it and shook his head. "I'm afraid I can't read any of this. But my boy, Samuel, he worked for the railroad camps few years back. He picked up a bit of the Chinese language. Not too much, but maybe enough to understand something." He called his son from the back room. Samuel was a young man with a friendly face and a sharp mind. He unfolded the letter and stared at the characters. His eyes widened a little. "I can't read every word," he said slowly. "But I recognize some. It says her name is May, Lynn, and something about starting a new life. Something about being promised a safe place. Maybe a home. May. Daniel looked at May Lynn. She stood still, watching them nervously. Her hands held tightly to the strap of her bag. Samuel continued, reading the parts he could guess. It also mentions a payment she made to someone. And something about trust. It's not clear, but it sounds like she was expecting someone to meet her here. Daniel felt a heavy feeling inside his chest. So she hadn't come by accident. She had been sent here, but not for him. Someone had misled her, maybe even cheated her. She had crossed the ocean, then crossed half the country, believing she was going toward a better future. And, instead, she ended up alone in a strange place with no way to talk to anyone and no idea what to do next. Mr. Green frowned. "That agency you used, maybe they mixed things up. Or maybe someone working for them was dishonest." Daniel nodded slowly. It made sense, but it also made things more complicated. He wasn't her intended husband, and she wasn't his intended bride. She was simply the victim of bad luck or dishonest people. May Lynn looked between their faces, trying to understand. She sensed something serious was being discussed, and her expression grew uneasy. Daniel felt responsible, even though none of this was his fault. He didn't want her to think she was a burden. He touched his chest and said slowly, "Daniel." She repeated the name softly, as if it were her first English word. Then she pointed toward herself and said, "May Lynn." He nodded gently. At least now he knew her name. It felt like a small step, but an important one. The townspeople gathered near the store, watching the scene but trying not to appear too nosy. Some whispered concerns. Others wondered how Daniel would manage. A few said it wasn't his problem and he shouldn't get involved. But others felt sympathy for the frightened woman who had come so far alone. Daniel asked Samuel to translate a simple message, that she could stay at his ranch for now, that she was safe, and that he would try to find answers. Samuel conveyed the words in slow, careful Chinese. May Lynn listened. Tears filling her eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of relief. She nodded repeatedly, grateful that someone cared. On the way back to the ranch, Daniel noticed Mei Lin holding the letter tightly against her chest. She kept looking at the open land, the sky, the distant hills. Everything was new to her. She didn't speak, but her eyes moved constantly, trying to learn her surroundings. Daniel felt a quiet responsibility forming in his heart. He didn't know why he felt that way, but he couldn't deny it. Back at the ranch, Mei Lin explored the small house with gentle curiosity. She didn't touch anything without permission. Daniel showed her where she could sleep, pointing to the freshly made bed. She placed her bag down carefully and smiled shyly at him. A small but sincere gesture that made the room feel warmer. She insisted on helping with chores, even though she didn't understand most instructions. She followed Daniel outside when he fed the animals. She watched him closely, copying his movements. When he lifted hay for the horses, she tried to do the same, even though the load was too heavy for her. Daniel quickly took the weight from her hands, afraid she might hurt herself. She stepped back, embarrassed, but he shook his head gently and smiled to show it was fine. As the sun began to set, she stood near the fence, watching the sky turn orange and gold. Daniel stood beside her, feeling the strange, quiet connection growing between them. They still couldn't speak to each other, not really. But something unspoken passed between them, a sense of safety, a sense of beginning, even if neither of them understood what kind. Daniel realized that the next days would be difficult. He would have to contact the agency, search for answers, and figure out what to do. But for now, as Mei Lin stood beside him in the fading light, he felt something unexpected. He didn't feel as alone as before. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual, even though he had barely slept. Thoughts about Mei Lin kept circling in his mind. He needed to understand her situation fully. And the only way to do that was to get her letter translated properly. At breakfast, Mei Lin sat quietly across the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of warm water. She looked calmer today, but Daniel could still see a bit of fear in her eyes, as if she was always waiting for someone to tell her where she belonged. Daniel pointed to himself and said, "Town." Then he pointed toward the road. Mei Lin nodded quickly, understanding he wanted to go somewhere. She picked up her small bag as if she thought she had to leave with him forever. Daniel gently shook his head and pointed to the house, trying to tell her she didn't have to pack everything. Slowly, she put the bag down, embarrassed by her misunderstanding. Daniel felt a small ache in his chest. She was trying so hard just to do the right thing. When they reached the general store again, Samuel was already there, waiting as if he expected them. He gave Mei Lin a polite smile, which seemed to comfort her a little. Daniel handed him the letter again and asked if he could try to read more. Samuel nodded and took a slow breath before starting to study the characters carefully. After a few minutes, Samuel spoke. "I can't understand every word," he said, "but I can understand enough to know the meaning." Daniel braced himself. Samuel began explaining piece by piece. The letter said that Mei Lin had lost her family during a difficult time. She had no brothers, no parents, and no home. Someone in her hometown told her about a program that helped young women travel to America to begin a new life, safe work, a stable home, and possibly marriage with a kind man. They took her money and promised everything would be arranged. The letter explained how she had trusted them, even though she had been scared. It said she believed in the dream of beginning again. But the last part of the letter made everything clear. Samuel read it slowly. The person who wrote this told her she would be met by a man who had agreed to take responsibility for her future. But it does not say who the man is. There is no name, no location, only the promise that she will be welcomed. Daniel felt his stomach twist. There was no name. That meant Mei Lin had been sent blindly, with no clear destination. The agency Daniel used must have mixed up her paperwork, or someone working there had been careless or dishonest. Either way, Mei Lin had been dropped into his life because of someone else's mistake. Mei Lin watched Samuel's face as he spoke, trying to understand. When he finished translating, she looked between Daniel and Samuel with questioning eyes. She spoke quietly in Chinese, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Samuel translated her words. She says she thought this place would be her new home. She says she doesn't want to go back because she has nothing there. She says she only wants a safe place where she can work and not be afraid. Thanks for watching. Daniel felt something shift inside him. She wasn't asking for much. She wasn't asking him to marry her. She wasn't demanding anything. She simply needed a safe place to exist. Mr. Green came over, listening quietly. Looks like she had a rough journey, he said gently. Poor girl trusted the wrong people. Happens to too many hard-working folks, sadly. Daniel nodded slowly. He felt responsible, even though this was not his doing. But he couldn't push her away. Sending her off alone would be cruel. Letting her wander without support would be the same as abandoning her. And Daniel wasn't the kind of man who walked away from someone in need. On the wagon ride back to the ranch, Mei Lin looked peaceful, as if she now understood a little more about what was happening. She still didn't know her future, but she felt safe sitting beside Daniel. She kept glancing at him with small, grateful eyes. She didn't need words to show how thankful she was that he hadn't pushed her away. After returning to the ranch, Mei Lin insisted on helping with chores again. Whenever Daniel walked outside, she followed at a small distance, watching carefully and trying to learn. Her movements were gentle, almost graceful. She moved quietly like she didn't want to disturb anything around her. When Daniel lifted buckets of water for the animals, she tried to do the same but struggled with the weight. He shook his head and lightly took the bucket from her hands, showing he didn't expect her to do heavy tasks. She nodded and instead began gathering small branches for firewood. She seemed relieved to be useful. As the day went on, Daniel noticed little things that surprised him. Mei Lin repaired a torn cloth on the porch using small, precise stitches. She swept the dust from the floor without being asked. She even washed the dishes slowly and carefully, as if afraid she might break something. Each small act made the house feel warmer, almost alive again. Later in the afternoon, she sat on the step outside the house, staring at the open field. The wind played with her hair as she watched the horizon. Daniel brought her a cup of tea. She accepted it with both hands, bowing her head slightly. He sat beside her. After a long while, Mei Lin pointed to the sky and said a simple English word she had clearly practiced repeatedly. Beautiful. Daniel looked at her in surprise. Her smile was shy, but real. He nodded and repeated the word softly. They sat together in that quiet moment, watching the sky change colors as the sun began to set. That evening, Daniel sat near the fireplace and thought deeply. Mei Lin sat across the room, sewing the loose button on one of his shirts. The simple domestic scene felt peaceful, almost like something he had only imagined before. He realized she had brought something into his life, something gentle, something warm that he hadn't felt in a long time. But deep inside, he also knew a decision was coming. She needed a future. She needed a place to belong. And he needed to figure out how to help her without causing misunderstandings or false hopes. Tomorrow, he would write to the agency. He would demand answers. But tonight, he let himself appreciate the calm presence of the woman who had arrived by accident but had already changed the quiet rhythm of his life. The days that followed moved slowly, but each one brought Daniel and Mei Lin a little closer to understanding each other. Life on the ranch had a rhythm, and Mei Lin watched it carefully, learning it piece by piece. Daniel would wake early, step outside to check the animals, and then return to the kitchen for a simple breakfast. Mei Lin began waking earlier too, quietly moving around the kitchen so she could prepare tea or warm water before he came in. He tried telling her she didn't need to do all that, but she would simply smile softly and continue working. Even without words, she made it clear that helping made her feel useful, and Daniel didn't have the heart to stop her. Communication between them was slow, sometimes funny, and sometimes confusing. Daniel tried teaching her simple English words each day: water, sky, horse, food, yes, no, thank you. Maylin repeated them with great effort, sometimes saying them perfectly, other times making mistakes that made Daniel smile without meaning to. When she didn't understand something, she would look at him with wide, patient eyes, waiting for him to try again. Her gentle determination made Daniel admire her more than he expected. One day, Daniel brought out an old notebook and began drawing simple pictures: an apple, a house, a cup, a saddle. He would draw the picture and say the English word slowly. Maylin leaned forward, her eyes shining with focus, repeating each word until she got close to the right sound. When she finally said a word correctly, she would beam with pride, and Daniel couldn't help but smile back. Those moments made his house feel warmer than it had in years. Maylin, in return, showed him small parts of her own life. She demonstrated how she folded clothes neatly in a specific way, how she brewed tea with special care, and how she cooked rice by washing it many times before placing it in the pot. Daniel watched her movements closely. Everything she did was gentle, precise, and thoughtful. Sometimes she hummed soft melodies in her own language while working, melodies that floated through the house like a calm breeze. Daniel had never heard anything like it, but it brought peace to the rooms. Not everyone in town understood this strange arrangement. When Daniel went to buy supplies, people asked questions. Some were curious, others confused, and a few were suspicious. They wondered why he had a foreign woman staying at his ranch when she wasn't the bride he had requested. Daniel didn't argue or explain too much. He simply said she needed help. Some nodded respectfully, understanding his nature. Others whispered behind his back, saying the situation made no sense. But Daniel didn't care what they said. He had made a decision. As long as Maylin had no safe place to go, she would stay with him. One afternoon, as they were fixing the chicken coop, a sudden storm rolled in. Dark clouds moved quickly across the sky, and strong winds began pushing the trees violently. The animals grew restless. Daniel motioned for Maylin to stay inside the house, but she shook her head and followed him instead. She wasn't afraid of a little rain. She just didn't want him working alone. The wind grew stronger as they worked together to close the gate and secure the loose boards. Maylin struggled against the wind, her hair whipping around her face. Daniel hurried toward her, worried she might slip in the mud. He guided her toward the barn, and they rushed inside just as heavy rain poured down. The horses were uneasy, stamping their hooves and snorting. Without hesitation, Maylin moved toward them, speaking softly in her language. The gentle tone of her voice surprised Daniel. The horses calmed slightly, responding to her soothing presence. When the rain grew louder, Daniel and Maylin stood side by side, watching the storm through a small crack in the barn door. Water rushed across the ground, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Maylin wrapped her arms around herself, shivering a little. Daniel noticed and handed her his coat. She hesitated, as if unsure whether she should accept it, but when she saw the sincerity in his eyes, she took it and wrapped it around her shoulders. A small smile formed on her lips. They stayed like that for several minutes, quiet, safe, and strangely connected while the storm raged outside. When the rain finally slowed and the sky began to clear, they walked back toward the house. Maylin stopped at the porch, looked at the wet ground, and said a slow, careful word she had learned. Together. Daniel froze for a moment, surprised by how much warmth that simple word carried. He nodded softly. It felt true. They had faced the storm side by side. And even though they barely knew each other's words, they understood each other in a different way. Inside the house, Maylin dried the dishes from breakfast again, even though they were already clean. It was her way of calming herself. Daniel checked the roof to make sure there was no leak. When he came back inside, Mei-Lin was standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding his shirt, the one she had repaired earlier. She handed it to him with both hands and bowed her head lightly. He took it gently and nodded with gratitude. These small exchanges had become their language. In the evenings, they sat near the fire after dinner. Mei-Lin sometimes practiced the English words she had learned. She would point at objects, chair, table, door, and say their names. Daniel would help her whenever she stumbled. Other times, she drew small symbols in the air and tried to teach him simple words from her own language. He repeated them awkwardly, making her giggle quietly. The sound of her soft laughter filled the house in a way Daniel had never experienced before. Days turned into a gentle pattern. Mei-Lin made the house brighter with her quiet care. Daniel found himself finishing chores faster than before because she was always nearby, offering small help where she could. She wasn't strong enough to lift heavy objects, but she added warmth to every task, making even boring chores feel peaceful. One evening, as the sun set beautifully behind the hills, Daniel sat on the porch while Mei-Lin stood a few steps away, watching the sky turn golden. She whispered an English word she had practiced earlier. Home. Daniel looked at her carefully. She repeated the word again, placing her hand gently on her chest. Daniel felt a deep, indescribable emotion rise within him. She wasn't calling the ranch her home in a bold way, only in a hopeful way, as if asking for permission. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just nodded slowly, a soft, meaningful nod. Mei-Lin smiled in relief, her eyes shining in the fading light. But later that night, when the house grew quiet, Daniel sat at the small table and reread the letter from the agency. He knew he had to send a message explaining what had happened. The agency had promised him a bride, not confusion and anxiety, but the more he thought about it, the more complicated everything felt. If they sent the woman he originally matched with, what would happen to Mei-Lin? Would she be asked to leave? Would she be sent somewhere unknown again? Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He didn't want to be unfair to anyone, but the thought of Mei-Lin leaving the ranch made the house feel cold again, even though she was still sitting only a few feet away, sewing quietly by the fire. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had never expected. He felt afraid of losing the quiet peace and gentle warmth that Mei-Lin had brought into his life. After the stormy days and quiet evenings they had spent together, Daniel knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't push the matter aside anymore. The letter from the agency still lay on the small table by the window, folded neatly, but heavy with meaning. At night, when Mei-Lin had gone to her room and the house had grown silent, Daniel often sat down and stared at that letter. It reminded him of the promise he had made to himself months earlier, the promise to finally seek companionship, to fill the lonely spaces of his life. But everything had changed when Mei-Lin stepped off the stagecoach instead of the woman he had been writing to. One morning, after finishing the chores, Daniel sat down at the table with a pen in his hand. He wrote to the agency, explaining exactly what had happened. The wrong woman had been sent, the paperwork had been mixed up, and no one had taken responsibility for her arrival. He didn't write with anger, but his words were firm. He wanted an answer. He also asked them what they planned to do about Mei-Lin, since she had clearly been misled. He mailed the letter with a heavy heart, knowing the reply would take several weeks to arrive. All he could do now was wait. But the waiting was not easy. Every day, he found himself watching Mei-Lin more closely. Not because he doubted her, but because he knew a decision about her future was coming. Whenever she smiled shyly at him or practiced new English words, he felt something warm settle inside him. Whenever she placed a cup of tea near him, or gently folded his shirts, or sat beside him quietly in the evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. During those days of waiting, Daniel noticed a change in Mei-Lin too. She seemed more relaxed now. Her steps inside the house were lighter. Her smiles came more easily. Sometimes, while sweeping the porch or feeding the chickens, she would hum softly, creating a gentle melody that floated through the ranch. Daniel didn't understand the words, but the sound alone made the lonely ranch feel alive again. One evening, as the sun painted the sky with oranges and pinks, Mei Lin approached Daniel with the notebook he had used to teach her English. She opened it, pointed at a word she had practiced, and said carefully, "Thank you." The pronunciation was simple but clear. Daniel felt a sudden warmth in his chest. He nodded and gently repeated the word back to her. Mei Lin smiled shyly and then sat next to him on the porch, watching the fading light. They didn't need many words to share the moment. Their silence felt gentle, comfortable, and full of unspoken understanding. Weeks passed, and finally, a reply from the agency arrived. The letter apologized for the mistake. They explained that there had been confusion because 2 applications had similar names, and someone had mixed the documents. The agency admitted they were responsible for sending Mei Lin to the wrong man. They also said they had already contacted the woman who was supposed to marry Daniel, and she still hoped to meet him. They offered to arrange her travel immediately, if Daniel wished. They also wrote that they could arrange a new home for Mei Lin, perhaps in another state, where a family was willing to take her in as a house helper. Daniel read the letter slowly. Every sentence felt heavier than the last. When he reached the part about sending the woman he had been matched with, he paused. He stared at the words without blinking. He had waited months for that woman. He had imagined a life with her. But now, everything felt different. The idea of a stranger arriving didn't comfort him the way it once had. His thoughts drifted toward Mei Lin, who was currently outside watering the small plants near the porch with gentle care. He folded the letter quietly. The house felt still. He sat there for a long time, thinking deeply. He thought about the morning she first arrived, standing in the dusty street with her small cloth bag. He thought about her fear, her confusion, her bravery. He thought about how she followed him into the unknown, how she tried to help with every little task, how she learned new words just to speak to him. He remembered the storm they faced together, the laughter she shared over small mistakes, and the quiet comfort she brought into his once empty life. That evening, Daniel stepped outside, where Mei Lin was sweeping the porch. She looked up and smiled gently, not knowing what he had read or what decision was waiting between them. Daniel held the agency letter in his hand, but he didn't show it to her. Instead, he stood beside her quietly, trying to gather the courage to speak. He pointed at himself and said, "I stay." Then he pointed to the ranch. Mei Lin nodded, thinking he was simply talking about the home. But then he pointed to her, looked into her eyes, and said, "You stay?" It was a question, not a demand, not a command, but a gentle offering. Mei Lin froze for a moment. Her eyes widened. She understood the meaning behind the simple words. She placed a hand slowly on her chest and whispered, "Stay." Daniel nodded again, more firmly this time. She looked around the ranch, the wooden porch, the quiet fields, the open sky glowing with the colors of sunset. She looked at Daniel, the man who had given her safety when she had no one. Her eyes softened. She nodded once, then again, more confidently. Her voice was soft but clear when she said, "Yes, stay." Daniel felt something inside him loosen, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. He didn't say anything poetic or dramatic. Mei Lin smiled back, her relief shining brighter than the fading sunlight. They stood together on the porch for a long time, letting the cool evening breeze wrap around them. It wasn't the life Daniel had planned. It wasn't the future Mei Lin had imagined. But somehow, through mistakes and misunderstandings, through fear and silence, through simple kindness and shared days, they had found something real. The agency expected him to write back with his decision, but Daniel already knew what he would say. He would decline the offer to bring the other woman. He would tell them he no longer needed another match. He wouldn't mention everything Maylin had brought into his life, the warmth, the peace, the quiet strength. That was something only he understood fully. Inside the house, the empty spaces no longer felt cold. The rooms no longer echoed with silence. The ranch no longer felt like a lonely corner of the world. It felt like a place where two lost souls had found each other by accident yet stayed by choice. And in that simple truth, a new life quietly began.